Oh, Matthew Jensen, you were the cinematographer of one of the big box office successes of the year, Wonder Woman. It's a film that received really strong reviews from critics and I think exceeded a lot of audience expectations. What do you think it is about this film that sets it apart from other superhero movies?
Well, I think in many ways, the movie is I don't think of it as a superhero movie. Actually, I think of it as a classic adventure film um, about a character's journey towards heroism, and so I think it is a kind of a return to form in many ways. It's character based. We invested a lot of time in understanding Diana and her where she comes from and where she's going, and it's all about the discovery of her own power. Um, so in that case, I think it fits right in with a lot of older movies that invest heavily in myth and that sort of thing. Um, so and it's singularly focused on her. So I think it defies a lot of the kind of modern incarnations of the superhero genre in that way.
It's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, that it's you don't think of it necessarily as a superhero film, more like a classic adventure film. I was going to ask, I mean, what were some of the visual inspirations that you guys took from? I mean, be it movies or things like that. What were some of your points of references for this?
Well, certainly as far as movies go, we looked at a lot of things. We obviously had the period elements of World War One, so we looked at a lot of World War One films, Paths of Glory, War Horse, A Very Long Engagement, and just tried to determine how they dealt with a lot of the staging and dealing with trenches and how they used color or contrast in the case of Paths of Glory. We also looked at Raiders of the Lost Ark. Um, Again, a sort of classic adventure movie now, particularly the way that scenes were staged. And we were trying to emulate some of that amazing flowing camera work and amazing dance that Spielberg does with camera and actors. And not too many people realize, but there are so many shots in Raiders that are scenes that are oneers, so we kind of like that, although we didn't quite emulate it. Um, it was a point of reference. We also looked at the original Superman and Batman Begins as just sort of the both the high bars for this genre, and they both dealt singularly with one character and that character's journey. So it mirrored our movie in many ways. Um, that was certainly sort of on the movie side what we were dealing with. Casablanca as well, period romance, that kind of thing. And we also looked at a lot of paintings from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and how World War One was represented, how London was represented. Um, those became touchstones for our lighting style and our color palette and that sort of thing.
Mhm. It's interesting because the movie is almost kind of divided up into these two halves. You have the beginning that is set in, and I'm going to mangle this name, Themyscira. Themyscira.
It's Kira.
Thank you.
I had the roughest time with that too. So
So, I mean, how did you talk about creating that world visually?
yeah, well, I think that world was tricky because the ideas that were behind their civilization was that they had developed in parallel to the modern man's world, but they just sort of took a different route. Instead of becoming a mechanized culture, they were a culture that used their natural surroundings. So they, their dwellings are built into mountainsides, and the rocks, and they harness the power of the water and the phosphorescence in the water to provide light, and so they're very in tune with nature, but yet they're just as sophisticated in many ways. So, it was tricky coming up with some of the lighting ideas at night, and the phosphorescence, and how do we achieve that, and then, but we really wanted to emphasize that this is paradise, and it is an island that is warmed by the sun, and the Amazons are a culture that's outside a lot, so they have very bronzy skin tones, and the grass is very green, and the water is this beautiful aqua cyan color, and so we really wanted to utilize a full colorful palette to really show this environment, and to contrast it with the journey that Diana takes into a mechanized modern world filled with charcoal and coal burning, and black skies, and overcast dreary winter, which was London and the front, basically.
Talk a bit more about in London. I mean, period London, World War II. What were you thinking of in terms of like, you mentioned some of this, but in terms of like color and lighting and framing and things like that?
Yeah, well, I think what we a lot of the references that we were looking at, the paintings, a lot of how they were representing London was almost in black and white, and I suspect because everything was sort of drenched in soot, and but we didn't, and we thought that that was a good starting point, but we didn't want to then shift into a completely desaturated movie. So we, particularly for the day exteriors, we moved away from a full color palette to kind of a lot cooler skies. We emphasized, kind of a steely blue, gray, cyan thing going on, and we were lucky because we were shooting in winter in London. We had a lot of overcast light, so that really contrasted with the sunny environments of Themyscira. And then a lot of the wardrobe has a lot of earth tones and blacks and things, so there wasn't a ton of color in front of the lens. So we just kind of reduced our palette at that point, and then for me, I was starting to light based on limited electricity, and so things were a little bronzier and or more, I guess, more amber, I guess, on the interiors, and kind of washed in candlelight and early electrical light, which tended to be a lot warmer. But then the whole way through, Patty kept emphasizing that she didn't want to make, a period film that was kind of dull and desaturated. So we were always trying to add this little comic book pop to everything, a little, what we called our 10% pop. So we were trying to goose the colors a little bit more, and in particular, I think you see that in the bar sequence where Diana meets her compatriots, her team, for the first time, and we use this color on the walls of this kind of crazy green colors that really isn't period correct, but that, and combined with the kind of yellow, dirty yellow that I was doing in the lighting, made for I think a really visually striking set. So we were trying to add simple little layers like that, combinations throughout the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the comic book, were you a fan of the original comics at all? Did you look to that for inspiration, or?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I was a fan of Wonder Woman. I grew up with the original TV series, as a kid, and I always loved Batman, and so I was very familiar with the sort of DC world. And if I look back, and I did have a lot of Wonder Woman comics, so it is flowing through my bloodstream. I think if just you were a kid and in the 1970s. It's like it just sort of filtered into your consciousness. And so I was definitely a fan. And I did look back to the George Perez version of Wonder Woman, his origin story, and that was kind of Patty's inspiration for the storyline of the movie. So it was interesting to look at how the colors were represented there and how Wonder Woman was drawn and just how the panels were drawn. And then I started to look at some of the more modern incarnations, the new 52 version of Wonder Woman, and just how the character evolved in, and and how you see her represented and what she's wearing, and just how the drawings just differ, and how to sort of combine all those sensibilities. I'm not sure that I could really describe how I did incorporate it, but it just became sort of information to sort of put into the blender.
I wanted to ask you about the no man's land sequence. It comes in the middle of the film. It's such a spectacular action sequence. Take us through that. What were some of your guys' ideas, inspirations, and how did you go about constructing them?
Yeah, well, that was one of the sequences that I worked on right from the outset. As soon as I started prep, we were diving into that sequence in particular. Visual effects had started sort of some preliminary pre-visualization of it, because we were dealing with so many elements, bullet hits, and how Wonder Woman moves and runs across the field. And so visual effects had wanted to sort a lot of that out. So we all got involved very early. And the major component to that whole sequence was that we knew that this was Wonder Woman's grand entrance. And it was the first time that we were seeing her in the suit, to see her fully utilize her powers, and to see the effect that she has on the world around her. She's ending the stalemate essentially, and the Allied forces, follow along with her because she's able to finally make headway in the war. So we knew it was a big moment, and we knew that we had to do Wonder Woman's entrance justice. So Patty and I talked a lot about trying to build the tension up until that moment, and at the moment when she emerges from the trench, it's a kind of a sense of relief and joy that you're finally seeing Wonder Woman do her thing. So we were working on that constantly to amp everything up until that point, and that's what led to the kind of these following shots through the trenches, and the actors kind of shouting over the bomb effects, and explosions going off in the background, and debris raining down into the trench. All those things were kind of meant to kind of pitch the audience up. So, and then it just became about then getting Wonder Woman across that field and doing her thing. And we shot over a course of several weeks, and there's visual effects elements, there's special effects elements, there's shifting weather patterns over the weeks that we were shooting it, complex camera rigs that were following her across the field, so that she could run. And the set was 300 yards of mud and debris. We're literally up to our knees in the mud. So it was tough. And it's also in the middle of February, and it's freezing and raining, and gals in a bathing suit essentially. So we were dealing with a lot.
Speaking of visual effects, I mean, you've worked on a lot of visually effects heavy films and television shows, including Game of Thrones. How does that affect your work, working with so many visual effects?
Well, I think now that I've done so many of these things now, I'm very comfortable working with the visual effects team, and realize that they're as critical to the look as anybody, and it's very important to be on the same page as the visual effects um, team. They where I end, they continue, and they the effects that they're doing, the backgrounds that they're putting in. I often have to, make the lighting inclusive and take into effect or take in what they're doing in terms of if there's an explosion or a fire effect. How close is that fire effect? Would that be lighting um, the golden lasso, for instance? That glows when it's used, and so we developed an LED tube that would glow amber, that then the could light the actors, but then visual effects could replace and make a better looking, prop. So we're always kind of handing off to one another. Um, so it's important that we're just always on the same page. They're a very key contributor to all of these kinds of movies.
Working with Patty Jenkins, what was that collaboration like?
It was great. Patty brings a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm. She was a huge fan of Wonder Woman. She's very inclusive. She really inspires and encourages, and I think that the way that we work together is that we bounce a lot of ideas off of one another about shots and about lighting and design, she's constantly trying to pull more out of me, and I'm adding a layer, and then she'll add another layer, and so it keeps building. And so I think we got very good results because of that kind of process. And the two of us kind of had a very similar aesthetic sensibility. We like a lot of the same movies, and we have a lot of the same background, and we sort of came up through the industry at the same time. So we have a lot in common. So we developed the shorthand pretty quickly.
Why do you think this film struck such a chord with people? I mean, one of the highest grossing movies of the year, one of the best reviewed movies of the year, awards talk. Why do you think it struck such a chord?
It's hard to say. I think we were the right movie at the right time. I think that, and something that we didn't really understand when we were making it is how powerful the images would be of Amazon's a whole group, an island of women taking on invaders that are all men. Wonder Woman, a solitary woman defying what everybody's telling her is the right thing to do and succeeding. I don't think those layers we anticipated sort of rippling, through the audience and through the culture. So I think that's the deeper level, but I just think the movie is fun, and the movie also works on another level. So I think when those two things kind of hit, and luckily we did, I think it has legs. It keeps people coming back.
Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on the film. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.